Hi, welcome to the second lecture for the heart. Now we're going to go into more detail and talk about specifics of how the heart actually functions. So what we'll speak about here is the anatomy and physiology of the cardiovascular system. And this is going to add on top of what we already went over with the introductory information. So very important that we remember what we discussed about already, because now we're going to build on top of that. When we talk about anatomy and physiology, this just means structure and function. Anatomy simply means the structure of something. And when we speak about physiology, we're saying how does that structure work? So the heart has its specific structure, but it also has its function. So that is what we're going to be discussing primarily with this lecture. What are the different structures of the heart and what are their functions? We already said what the function of the heart is. It is to simply pump blood to the rest of the body to deliver that oxygen that the rest of the body needs. Now, this is important to think of it this way because this then parallels with what we will start talking about when we talk about the different disease processes, right? So that's when we talk about patho. Patho means a disease state. So with the pathoanatomy, there's something going on with the structure. There's some impairment. For example, if we look at bone, bone has a structure, but if it breaks, there's some impairment that occurs, right? So when we speak about pathoanatomy, it's going to be some impairment to the actual structure. And then the pathophysiology is going to be some dysfunction that arises because of whatever disease process is going on. So it's not going to function properly. So this is going to be important once we start talking about heart failure. Structurally, there's going to be changes that we'll see, but also there's going to be impairments, the function that arises as well. So anatomy and physiology, pathoanatomy and pathophysiology. Once we go over the structure and the function, this is going to lead us nicely when we start talking about disease. And starting here, we just look at the heart. So here we have this picture of the heart. And what we can see is just start here with the external components. Looking at the outside of the heart, you can see there's a lot of different areas to this, but the main area I want you to focus on is this vessel. And we will not go into too much detail with this today, but when we start speaking about the disease processes, this becomes important. So the first structure is going to be on the outside, and we have these, which are called the coronary arteries. And the coronary arteries run on the outside. You can see this here, more on the outside of the heart. And I like to think of the heart as a cake. And cakes, they have how they look on the outside, but once you cut into them, you can see that there are different layers. The heart's no different. On the outside, we can see what the heart looks like, but once we cut into the heart, we start to see different layers that gives us further information about the actual structure of the heart. And when we start slicing into the heart, what we're going to do is go from the outside all the way to the inside. So the heart is actually going to be this sack of tissue. And on the inside, you're actually going to have a cavity. It's hollow, right? There's a space in there. And on the outside of the heart is going to be the pericardium. That's our first layer. And right now, I want you all to just think about the pericardium as one layer. So all of this here is the pericardium, and the pericardium actually has multiple layers to it. But as I mentioned, I want you to just think about it as one structure right now. And then as we start going further in, right, we've sliced the heart. As we start going further in towards this empty, hollow area of the heart, we're going to then bump into the next layer, which is the myocardium. Now, this should sound familiar because we talked about how the heart has two main cells, the pacemaker cells and the myocardial cells. So the myocardial cells make up the bulk of the heart. And as you can see, this is a very thick layer, and it's going to be that layer of muscle that's actually causing the contraction of the heart. So this is a very important layer here. And then when we go further in, we have our last layer, which is the most innermost layer, meaning that this is the last layer before we get into that cavity, right? The inside of the heart. And that's called the endocardium. And the endocardium is just that last layer. And as you can see, it's a very thin layer. And when we look at this, this is the structure, right? As we cut through the heart, we looked at the outside already and we saw these arteries and we saw all of these bumps all over the heart. But once we cut through the heart and we look through the layers, we can see these different structures. And these structures are going to have specific functions. And the main unit, right, the most important part, the meat of the topic, no pun intended, is going to be the myocardium. So your myocardium is going to be what contains the actual contractile units, what is making the heart contract. So if you want to think of it this way, you can just think of these two layers. It's sandwiched, right, between the endocardium and the pericardium. You can just think of it as, right, these two layers, the endocardium and pericardium, are protecting this layer, because if this layer, anything happens, it's going to be very bad, right? But same idea, we also want these two areas that are protecting it to be functioning well. So something can go bad with any of these layers. And when we look at the pericardium, really it's like a grocery bag, right? You put your grocery in the bag and you stick the heart into this grocery bag, and it keeps the heart from, falling out or doing anything else, right? Really what the pericardium is doing, it allows the heart to do its job, right? To be able to contract and squeeze. And as it contracts and it's squeezing blood out the heart, it gives the heart the ability to move freely and not have interference from the other structures outside of the heart. And then we go on the inside, and really the endocardium, once again, is going to be protecting the myocardium, but it's also going to be allowing for blood to flow smoothly, right, through the inside of the heart. So this is very important to understand what the function of these layers are, because when we start talking about some of the disease processes, it's going to specifically affect those functions, with the endocardium, with how the blood is flowing through the heart, and then with the pericardium, with how the heart is actually able to move freely. And then the myocardium, the impairment there is going to be how well the heart can contract. And then when we look at the other components of the heart, now we're on the inside and we can see this drawing here. And on the inside, what we're going to see is that there are four chambers of the heart. And we can just look here and we'll be able to see those chambers. And there are also four valves. So when we look at the heart, let's simplify it. There's going to be a right side of the heart, and then there's going to be a left side of the heart. This is one of the other reasons I like the heart, because everything is pretty much named based on, it's pretty intuitive. There's a right side, left side. So anything on the right side is going to have that phrase right. And we have these two areas, right? We have the atrium and then the ventricle. And when we're looking at the heart on the inside, I like to think about the atrium ventricles as rooms, right? So the heart is like a house, right? And in a house, you're going to have different rooms, and each room is contained. It has its walls, and then you can walk and you can go to the other room. So these chambers, right, the four chambers are going to be those different rooms that you can walk into. And as I mentioned, here we have the right atrium and then the right ventricle. And sure enough, we look on the left side, it's mirrored also. We have the left, we have the left atrium, and then we have the left ventricle. So these are the four different rooms that we have in the heart. And very important here to note is that these rooms, right, they have these doors that close and open. And we're going to have four different valves. And the valves, you can think of those as the doors, right? That open and close that allow you to go into different rooms. And over here, once again, the heart is very intuitive. They name it based on what it is. We have the atrioventricular valve, atrium ventricle. So that valve is going to be the door that is separating the atrium from the ventricle. And this atrioventricular valve on the right side is actually called the tricuspid valve. And then if we go on the left side of the heart, we see there's another door once again that's separating the left atrium from the left ventricle. And this one is called the bicuspid valve or also the mitral valve. And in combination, those two separate the top part from the bottom part of the heart. That is your atrium from your ventricle. And then you have another valve that's then going to separate, right, the ventricle from the rest of the body. And on the left side, what's connected to the left ventricle is going to be the aorta, which is pumping blood out to the rest of the body. So you're going to have one valve there, right? So this is your door. You have one door there that is going to close, and that one is called the aortic valve, named right after what it's next to. And then on the right side, the valve is going to be the ventricle is going to be pushing blood out into the lungs, right? The pulmonary system. So that door or the valve that is closing or separating the right ventricle from the pulmonary system is called the pulmonary valve. So pretty simple there. It's named after what it's next to. And these are very important because it allows for movement of blood, right? So imagine you're in one part of the room. You're in this house and you're in the right atrium, which is one room. In order for you to go to the next room, which will be the right ventricle, you will need to go through the door. So these valves are very important for allowing blood to flow through the heart. So just to summarize, we talked about the layers of the heart and their function. This is very important because when we start seeing issues or dysfunction, it's usually because there's some change to these structures, whether there's something going on in the different layers or in the different chambers. And then we also talked about the chambers of the heart and their function. So we talked about the right side of the heart and the left side of the heart. And we talked about how we have the atrium and then we have the ventricles. So those are the different chambers of the heart. Just to review, think about these questions. What layer of the heart is responsible for myocardial contraction? And then what layer of the heart allows smooth flow of blood through the heart? And then what layer of the heart allows the heart to move freely? So if you want, you can just pause and think about that, but I'll answer that now. So the easiest one you should be able to come up with is the first one. Myocardial contraction occurs because of the myocardial cells, right? And that lives in the myocardium. That's the layer that we see the myocardium, the myocardial cells. So that is the answer for the first one. And then allowing smooth flow of blood through the heart. So the endocardium is going to be what allows this smooth flow of blood, because remember, the endocardium is the most innermost layer. Not only is it protecting the myocardium, but it's also allowing blood to move freely throughout the heart. And then what layer allows the heart to move freely? So this is the actual contraction, right? The heart has to compress and then it expands. As it's filling with blood, it expands. As it contracts, it reduces in size. So to allow this motion, we have that layer, the outermost layer, which is the pericardium. And then how many chambers does the heart have? Well, four chambers. And those chambers are the atrial chambers and the ventricular chambers. And there's two of those on the right side and then on the left side. And then what chambers are responsible for pushing blood out of the heart? So we said that the ventricles are going to push blood either to the pulmonary system or through the rest of the body, right? So those are going to be the chambers, your ventricles, that push blood out of the heart. So I think it's good to just take a break after that and let the information digest. And then we'll just jump right into the next topic. So we'll talk about cardiovascular hemodynamics. And hemodynamics is just a fancy word to say the flow of blood. That's all hemodynamics means. And when we look at the flow of blood, we already started talking about that with the previous lecture. And we can look at the flow of the blood as it goes through the heart, as it goes through all of those chambers. And that is going to be more of a central hemodynamic that we're going to look at. But remember, it's the cardiovascular system. So we're also going to have peripheral blood flow. So we'll discuss this later on, and this will definitely come into discussion when we start talking about the some of the the pathology that occurs in the peripheral system. But for this lecture, we're going to just focus on the central changes and central hemodynamics. And when we look at hemodynamics, let's think about basic rules. I like to simplify it, right? So when we look at some general rules of the flow of blood through the heart, it's going to be a mostly active process. And it's going to have this pressure gradient that it's moving through because we're dealing with a fluid, right? And fluids like to move through pressure. And then we have this principle that we're going to fill first and then pump next. So this is primarily what we're going to look at, right? How we're going to view the heart in its healthy, normal state. It fills first and then it pumps next. Let's just stick with that. And then we have this left and right synchrony. And I say synchrony-ish because there is some slight delay, but it's not, it's a millisecond. But really, we can think of how the left and the right side of the heart are working together, right? And then we also want to look at this other rule of having a constant one-way flow. So the blood flowing one direction through the heart, and there's always some constant movement. So these are the general rules that we should just keep in mind when we look at the hemodynamics of the heart. Because then once we start speaking about the specific paths that we see the blood flow through, we have to keep those in mind, right? So we can look at how the blood flows just generally. Broadly speaking, blood is going to come from outside the heart, which is from the rest of the body, right? And also the lungs. Anything outside of the heart, the blood is going to then go into the heart, and then it's going to move through the heart and then go back out of the heart. That is, broadly speaking, big picture, how blood is flowing through the heart. But then when we look at it more specifically, it's going to go right and left atrium that are receiving blood. That's the first step. And then it's going to go into the ventricles, the right and left ventricle. So we go from the outside of the body and we said it goes into the heart. But specifically, it's going to go into the right and left atrium, and then it goes into the right and left ventricle before it then goes out to the rest of the body. And then bringing it into perspective some more. And also, to help you understand this better, we're going to break it down. So imagine you're a red blood cell, and you're a red blood cell just flowing through the cardiovascular system. We're going to track the path that you're going to take. So as mentioned, it's happening together. So it's going into the right and left atrium together, and then to the right and left ventricle before it leaves. But as a drop of blood, and we're looking at a red blood cell, you're first going to enter the heart through the right atrium, and then you're going to go down into the right ventricle, and then you're going to make your way outside of the heart into the lungs. And then you get oxygen and you drop off carbon dioxide, which we mentioned in the prior lecture. And then we come back into the heart, and we come back into the heart once again through the atrium, right? And that's going to be the left atrium. And then we go into the left ventricle before we finally exit out of the heart through the aorta. So as that drop of blood, you can see the flow, the path that that red blood cell is going to take as it moves through the heart. But the reality, as we mentioned, this is all happening together, right? The blood, all the heart sees is receiving blood together simultaneously in the right atrium and left atrium. And then that blood is going to go into the left and right ventricle. And then the blood is going to then leave. And when we look at our rules, we can start going into more detail here. And we say the first rule, right, was that it's a mostly active process and it's pressure driven. And we have this principle of fill first, pump next. So to explain this more, a lot of what's going on with the heart, how the blood is moving through the heart, it's requiring some energy. And that energy is coming from the heart actually contracting. So we said the heart contracts, right? In order for the heart to contract, that's an active process. But when the heart is actually relaxing and filling up with blood, that process is usually more passive. The blood is just falling into the heart. And that's usually because there's a pressure gradient. So if we have our first stage, right, with the atrium, right, we look at both of the atriums and we're going to see that the blood is going to dump into the atrium. And when the blood goes into the atrium, we're going to then have the blood go into the ventricles. So as the blood is going into the ventricles, the atria are actually going to have higher pressures compared to the next destination, which will be the ventricles. So because the pressure is lower here, the blood moves freely. Same idea when the blood is leaving from the ventricles and going out, it's going to push out against a pressure that's lower than it. And this allows that blood to flow through the heart, going from high pressure to lower pressure. And when it's leaving at each stage, whether it's going from the atrium to the ventricle, it's going to be active with some form of contraction. So that's why we get this process of the heart filling first, whether it's in the atrium or ventricle, it fills first and then it pumps next. So why does the heart need a relaxation phase? So this is a very important topic, right? Because when we start seeing in different disease states, this is actually one of the problems. The heart does not relax. So I like to think of the heart as a sponge. And with sponges, if you squeeze it, right, it gets saturated with fluid, let's say water, and you squeeze it, you're able to wring out all that water. But if you let go and the sponge starts to go back in size, it can pick up more fluid. But what happens if we squeeze that sponge and then we don't let it relax and come back to its resting state, and then we squeeze it again? If we do not allow that sponge to relax, it does not absorb any more fluid. And when we squeeze it again, nothing is going to come out, or we might just have a very small amount that comes out. So this is very important. We need the heart to be able to relax because that's when it gets filled up with fluid, allowing the heart then to eject blood for the next round. And we talked about how there's a slight delay, but altogether, this is happening simultaneously where the right and left atrium are working simultaneously, and then the left and right ventricles are contracting simultaneously. And in order for this is important because it allows that blood to flow in a predictable and coordinated manner. And in order for this to happen, we have to go back to what we talked about here with our valves. So if you are, for example, in one area of the house, right, you're in one room, in order for you to go to the next room, you have to walk through the door. So what happens if that door is closed? You can't go through that door, right? So you won't be able to flow through there. So in order for you to go to the next room, or in order for the blood to move from one chamber to the next chamber, the valve must open. And when the valve opens, the blood is able to move to the next chamber. And then what happens when the blood then wants to leave and go to the next area? So from the ventricle going into the rest to the aorta or pulmonary vein, artery. Well, in order to do that, you're going to need the next set of doors to open. So the blood then goes into the ventricles, and then the next set of doors open, and the blood can go out. But what happens behind? If this door is still open, we might get blood not only going out from the aorta and then the pulmonary artery, but we might also see blood going back into the aorta, into the atrium, sorry. So what needs to happen is that not only does the next door need to open, but the prior door that the blood went through needs to close. So what we see is this valve is going to close when the ventricle is contracting, because then the blood can then flow either through the aorta or through the pulmonary artery. And then when the blood is going into the ventricle, this door needs to open. So this will be your atrioventricular valves. They're going to open to allow blood to flow from the atrium into the next chambers, which will be the ventricles. But we also see the aortic and pulmonic valves close because we don't want blood to go into those areas also. So that is how we're able to maintain a one-way direction, a one-way flow. Because if these doors do not close, the blood's going to go backwards. So that's the answer there. Closure and opening of the heart valves. And we get to our next topic here, which are the different phases of the heart. We already talked about the importance of the heart to relax, right? The heart needs to relax, but then the heart also contracts. So those are two specific phases, and it can happen in the atrium or ventricle. But usually when we talk about these phases, it's usually being spoken about with regards to the ventricle. So that's what I'll just discuss here. So we have the phase where the heart's relaxing. And when the heart relaxes, it's doing that to allow blood to come into the heart and fill it up. And that phase is called diastole. And then once the heart fills up, the heart then pumps and contracts. And when it contracts, specifically with the ventricle, it's going to push blood out right into the aorta or pulmonary artery. And with that, that is called systole. And the heart is going to do this repeatedly. It keeps doing this. It receives blood, it pumps the blood out. It receives blood, pumps the blood out. And each time it receives and pumps it out, we count that as one cardiac cycle. One cardiac cycle is where we have diastole, where the heart relaxes and fills up with blood. And then we have contraction of the heart, systole, which pumps out blood. Put that together, we get one cardiac cycle. If we do that again, that's the second cardiac cycle. And repeat that. So just to summarize, we went over the hemodynamics of the heart. And remember, that's just a fancy word to say how is blood flowing, moving through the heart. And we talked about the different chambers, right? And how the blood is going from one chamber to the next chamber. And we talked about how this is done synchronously, right? We're going blood going into the right atrium and left atrium together, and then it's going into the right and left ventricle together, and then it's being pumped out either to the lungs or to the rest of the body. And it's going through there, and we have this one-way flow. And the one-way flow is maintained by those doors, which are called the valves. And by the valve opening, it allows blood to go from one chamber to the next chamber. And the chamber then has to close to keep blood from going backwards. And that's how that flow is maintained. And the heart sustains that blood flow, right? As we mentioned, from those different phases. So we have the diastolic phase and we have the systolic phase. It receives the blood, it pushes the blood out, and it just constantly does this. And when we have one cycle of that, of the heart relaxing and receiving blood and then contracting and pushing blood out, that's called a cardiac cycle. So just to review, answer these questions here, and I'll give you the answer. So the first part, describe the path of a red blood cell. Describe the path a red blood cell will take through the heart. Specify relevant structures. So to properly answer this, you want to describe that the heart is going to have those different chambers and the different valves. So there's 4 of them. So you want to make sure you list all of those. So the red blood cell is going to start its journey by entering into the right side of the heart, specifically the right atrium. And then it goes through our first valve, which is going to be your tricuspid. And the easy way to remember which valve comes first, I use this phrase, try before you buy. So if you're going to, you're shopping for clothes, you try it before you buy it. So the tricuspid comes first before the bicuspid. So the red blood cell is going to go from the right atrium and then pass through the tricuspid valve, and then it's going to go into the right ventricle, and then it's going to then go through the pulmonic valve into the lungs, and then it comes back to the left side of the heart through the left atrium, and then it goes through the bicuspid valve into the left ventricle, and then it finally makes its way to the rest of the body by going into the aorta through the aortic valve. So that is the flow of blood and all the relevant structures. And then what must happen for blood to flow out of the ventricles? We must have contraction, right, of the heart, of the ventricles. But first, before it contracts, we have to fill before we pump. So we first have to go through the diastolic phase to get blood into the ventricles before it then goes through systole and pumps the blood out. And then list the events that occur during one cardiac cycle: systole and diastole, relaxation of the heart and filling of the heart of the ventricles with blood, and then pumping out of that blood during systole. So that is the content for this session in this lecture. I hope this helps, and we'll go through more details on the following lecture, and then we'll slowly start making our way towards some of the disease processes, and also how do we assess and do some measurements.